Role passives, a new idea implemented in Overwatch 2 starting in Beta 1. Each unique role is going to have a passive that affects, a global passive if you will, that affects every hero in that category. For example, tanks is reduced knockback as well as reduced ult charge given when taking damage. DPS's originally was movement speed plus reload speed, and supports is a passive regen over time that activates after 2 seconds of taking damage. And now, you know, SVB said in the Group Up podcast in the Great Support Debate that he thought that role passes were another thing to kind of show, like, hey, Overwatch 2 is a new game, new like 5v5 PvP, like it's new experience, it's brand new, right? I kind of agree with him in that. We're about a year into Overwatch 2. We're a little over a year, actually, of Overwatch 2. And in my personal opinion, I don't think the role passives are actually a good thing for the game. I'm going to go on to cite some of the reasons for that in this video. But as usual, be sure to leave some feedback down below. What do you think? Do you think the role passives are OP? Do you think they should be in the game? Do you think they're fair? Let me know down in the comments, but I encourage you guys to listen to what I have to say first. So yeah, let's just get right into the elephant of the room here, which is the support passive. The support passive is by far the best global passive in the game. I would go as far as to say the support passive is 3 to 4 times, maybe 5 times better than the DPS passive, for example. It's just such enormous value, and something that people complain about with supports a lot when you're playing tank. It just feels like you get hit with every single cooldown. Well, the reason why supports are able to use all of their cooldowns super aggressively is because they don't have to use them to heal themselves if they're positioned well in a fight, because the support passive will heal them. For example, on a nade, right? Or BAP shift, right? The supports are almost guaranteed to have their abilities in big moments instead of actually having you force them out. Or, for example, if you're taking a poke war, right? If you're a DPS and you're poking at a support, well, they'll just stop and not peek you, not have to use their cooldowns, and be able to engage you in the duel, while you as a DPS player has to go kite for a mega, kite to your supports, do a ton of things. And if you go back and you look at how playing support in Overwatch 1 was compared to Overwatch 2, well, Karq kind of mentioned this in the Great Support Debate, it was totally different. Like, you had to use your cooldowns as a support on yourself way more, as opposed to the other team, especially if you're mispositioning. But now, with the support passive, you can peek anywhere, take duels where you want, and it doesn't really matter because you're automatically going to heal. The ability to passively regenerate is so much stronger than the other passives that I think it is the tipping point for right now as to why support is so much better than both damage and tank, really, in terms of how it feels to play the role, how it can impact the game. It's just by far the best, right? And I think that regen factor is the big thing, and where, like, I almost would say DPS should have the exact same passive as the supports, but then what's unique about it, right? And that goes on to my point as to why I just don't think they belong in the game, because there's no way to make them fairly reward each role, right? Like, for example, even Lucio, I think heroes like that, I think they had to have custom changes to when the role passive actually activated. But yeah, the bottom line is the ability to regenerate is just overpowered. It's by far better than both tanks and damage, and I think that it is single-handedly one of the big driving factors, probably the biggest driving factor right now that would be the easiest to change, that makes support by far the best role in the game. I think that if they changed the role passive or took them out, I think there'd be much more balance between all 3 roles, and the game would feel much more fair. Let's move on to the tank passive here. Again, I don't like this. Like, I think a big downside to some of the tanks was how much ult charge they gave, like Roadhog. And now in 5v5, it's definitely more fair than the support one, right? Because, if a tank is just hard feeding ult charge, then especially as a solo tank, that's just a lot more pressure on you, especially if you're as if you're as vulnerable to CC as all the rest of the cast. But I can't help but feel like some of the big playmaking opportunities just simply don't exist anymore, because not only is there only one tank that on the field, but you're not ever able to get like environmental kills on that tank. You're not ever able to boop that tank. And granted, heroes like, you could argue, well, heroes like Ryan shouldn't be able to get booped away as much. And it's like, okay, well, then maybe that should be his specific passive for his character, right? Like Steadfast was as an ability that we had to eventually add, because the DLC tanks like Orisa and Sigma, Orisa had CC immunity with Fortify, and Sigma had his stun and his grasp. So Ryan needed that extra utility to be able to contend and compete with characters like that. But I feel like having it just be passively on the roll took away a lot of the punishability and skill ceiling from the game, because it just said, okay, you don't necessarily have to play right when playing these characters, or play perfectly, or play smart, right? You can kind of just walk around and we'll passively reduce this value for you. I think that takes away from what made Overwatch great. I think what made Overwatch so much fun was all the ways to make big plays happen. Silosa kind of said this a long time ago, where he said, what made Overwatch so fun was the ability to make big plays, like the big pop-off moments. That's what made people fall in love with Overwatch. And, you know, I almost wanted to bring that point up for 6v6 and 5v5. It just seems like there's not as many big plays, because there's one less player on the map, right? So, like, that's obviously going to happen. But I wasn't sure if I wanted to argue that or not. But, you know, going back to the subject matter, you know, it's just, I think having things and abilities in the game that passively give players value is the exact concept that took away from what made Overwatch so beautiful. And so that's why I'm not a huge fan of the tank passive. It's a little bit unfair to tank players, because their passive just isn't as good as the supports. It's just passive value that's kind of silly to just give players for no reason. And if characters need something specific like that, then you can give it to them specifically on their character. But again, that passive is not as good on some characters as it is on others, right? For example, like Reinhardt, obviously, like that tank passive is going to be really good. For Zarya, though, it's not really as good, because Zarya doesn't necessarily need to get knocked back, right? So it's impossible for Blizzard to make this role passive be as good for each character as, like, evenly. Like, you can't make it equally as good for each character, and I just don't think that just makes it even harder to balance the game, in my opinion. I just don't think that's a good idea. Moving on to the DPS passive, and I think what's happened with this one is the best example as to why role passive shouldn't exist, at least when the roles are divided the way that they are now, in that, you know, there's tank, DPS as a collective, and support as a collective. For example, right, the original DPS passive, where it gave movement speed and reload speed, that was really good, but it was only really good for maybe 5 or 6 of the characters, right? It was really good for Genji. It was really good for Tracer. It was really good for Echo. It was really good for Reaper, right? Because these characters got movement speed buffs, and they benefit the most from movement speed and reload speed, right? But what about a hero like Hanzo, who to this day, even right now, still doesn't have a role passive, because the DPS passive is just reload speed, and Hanzo can't reload, right? There is no way that in DPS, when they're just being listed as a collective, right, there's no way to make a role passive when there's so much diversity in the DPS role that that benefits Hanzo as much as it would benefit Tracer, as much as it would benefit Genji. The archetypes in the role are so fundamentally different, there's no way to make them all benefit equally as much. And if you can't do that, then there's no point in having the role passive, right? Because it's just going to throw the balance of the game out of whack. Like, I think that the DPS passive was a big reason that Sombra had to get nerfed as hard as she did. I think, you know what? It was a huge reason that Genji got gutted in Season 1, right? And then we nerfed the passive alongside Genji, and then Genji was just obsolete after his 2 weeks of time to shine, right? So I just don't think there's a fair way for these passives to be implemented. And, you know, it was a cool idea, but if you want to give characters passives, you should just give it to their kit on their own. What about heroes that have passive abilities and some that don't, right? I think it'd be cool. Maybe this is how you implement it. Maybe like this, guys. Maybe if your hero doesn't have a specific passive for themselves, then they get the DPS passive, which would be reload speed or something like that, right? But some of these characters are just going to have 2 passives, right? Genji has wall climb, and so does Hanzo, I guess. And they also, well, Hanzo doesn't get the, excuse me, Hanzo does not get the reload speed, but you get what I'm saying, and you guys get the point that I'm bringing up. There's no way to make this passive benefit each character equally, right? Because the design variance is just so great. So if a character is going to have a passive, it should be a unique passive to them that takes into account the rest of their kit. Not just, oh, well, we're going to make a role passive and give it to everybody because we want the game to have new features. It's fine to want to have the game have new features, or want to have the game have new features, but I just think how these passives have been implemented haven't really helped the game, to be honest with you. I don't think they've really helped the game. I think they've just made the gap between characters even greater, specifically the gap between roles even greater, because the support passive is just leagues above everything else, and they didn't solve a specific problem. If you were to ask yourselves, what problem did role passive solve? I think the best answer that you could come up with is that it helped tank the most, right? Because solo tank might need that CC reduction. It might need to give less ult charge. I just I don't think that's better for the game to have that be in there. But I can at least understand that argument. So what do you guys think? Do you think that role passives were actually a good idea? Do you think they were implemented well? Do you think that maybe the implementation of them needs a change? You've heard my thoughts here. I don't think there's a way to make them healthily fit in the game. I don't think that they're a great idea in hindsight. I think that maybe the way you could make it work is if the supports or DPS or heroes in general don't have their own unique passive, that the role passive that's given just directly applies to them. I don't know. I think that it's probably better to just have hero passives be unique to them so that it actually can directly affect their kit. And you're not stuck in a very generalist situation that's clearly not a great solution for a character like Hanzo, who just simply will not have a role passive when Genji, Tracer, Echo, or I guess really the hit scan heroes now because it's only reload speed, benefit from having that passive. I think the disparity is too great. So yeah, comment down below what you think. I'm very curious to see. Thank you all so much for watching. Expect some Season 7 streams coming up around the corner. Not sure how long I'll be able to play, but we'll get our time in while we can because I'm blocked over on Mindplex right now. I got no work to do. But yeah, I appreciate you all. See y'all later. Take care. Peace out.